So in this video I will discuss about the external feature of the cerebrum. As you know, the cerebrum is one of the most important structures of the human brain. It is consisting of different regions. Before that, I would like to go through the other parts of the brain, that is the other than the cerebrum, that is the encephalon, consisting of mainly thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, metathalamus also, and brainstem. It is consisting of the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, and cerebellum. So these are the brief structure about the human brain. So among these, the cerebrum occupies the prime position, as because it takes the major area in human brain. So this is a structure which is mainly responsible for collecting the different sensory inputs from the different parts of the body and analyzing it, and it is also responsible for logical analysis and storing of the information for future use, and responsible for generation of the motor impulses which are essential for supporting the life. So this structure is very important within our body, and the cerebrum, if we go through the cerebrum, and this is a superior view, if we can find that the whole cerebrum is divided into two halves medially by the longitudinal fissure. It divides into two halves. One is left cerebral hemisphere and another is right cerebral hemisphere. So this longitudinal fissure actually divides the cerebrum into two halves, two identical halves, and these two identical halves are responsible for controlling the activity of the different parts of the body. Very interestingly, the left cerebral hemisphere is responsible for controlling or receiving the information from the right part of our body, whereas the right cerebral hemisphere is responsible for controlling the activity of the left part of our body and also receiving the information from the left part of our body. Other than these, we are having the central sulcus, and this central sulcus divides the brain cerebral hemisphere into two major halves. So that will be discussed on later on. One is frontal lobe, another is parietal lobe, and this is the precentral gyrus and this is the postcentral gyrus. So cerebrum has, if we go through the structure, the cerebrum has an outer layer, the cerebral cortex, which is known as cerebral cortex. This brown colored structure, which is called as cerebral cortex, and it is mainly consisting of the cell bodies of different neurons. So this structure is brownish in or gray in, sorry, it's better to say gray in nature. So this is called as gray matter also, and the under this gray matter there are white matter, which is composed of myelinated nerve fiber, both ascending and descending nerve fiber. Generally, the ascending nerve fibers are responsible for collecting the information from the ascending fibers are responsible for collecting the information from the different parts of the body towards the brain, and the descending nerve fibers are responsible for collecting the information carrying the information away from the central nervous system towards the different effector organs of our body. So other than these, the ascending and descending nerve fibers, other fibers, neuronal structures are there which are responsible for collecting the different parts of the brain, and they can communicate with each other. As for example, here you can find that corpus callosum. It's a structure which actually connects the two hemispheres, and it's a C-shaped structure which connects the two hemispheres. And there are internal capsules also, which are also responsible for collecting the passing the information from towards the different parts of the body, from the different parts of the brain also, and the anterior commissure fiber. So these are the connecting fibers which actually connects, and there are different parts of the brain, and they communicate with different parts of the brain, and so that the every functions or functional activities can be done properly. So within the cerebral hemisphere, there are different types of neuronal cell bodies that are aggregated, and these structures are called subcortical nuclei. So within cerebral hemisphere, different types of neurons, they aggregates, they forms the different neuronal structure, which are called as subcortical nuclei. So as they are located in below the cortex, that's why they are called as subcortical nuclei. And as I told earlier, that we are having the C-shaped fibers, that is called as corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres and which carries the information between two hemispheres. So this main function of the corpus callosum is to sending the information from one part of one hemisphere to the another hemisphere, so that both the hemisphere can do the work simultaneously. So this is very important point. As if the corpus callosum is damaged or by any means, so communication in between these two hemispheres will be affected. So the corpus callosum is connecting the two hemispheres. Other than this, there are other fibers also, which I also discussed earlier in earlier slides. So each cerebral hemisphere can be divided into 6 lobes. So functionally they can be divided into 6 lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital and temporal. So these are the major lobes. Other than these, another is insular lobe and the limbic lobe. So these two lobes are also the part of the cerebral hemisphere, and here you can find that this is insular lobe. It is located at the level of lateral sulcus, at the deep region of the lateral sulcus, so that it cannot be visualized from the outside, but it is located within the lateral deep region of the lateral sulcus. Like that, the limbic lobe is located at the base of the cerebrum. So limbic lobes are located at the base of the cerebrum. So here you can find that this is frontal lobe, and the central sulcus is the structure which actually divides the frontal and parietal lobes. So frontal and parietal lobes, they are divided by the central sulcus, and the parietal lobe is sensory in nature. That means all the sensory inputs from the different parts of our body is coming towards the parietal lobe. So parietal lobe is sensory in nature, and frontal lobe is motor in nature. So it is responsible for generation of the motor impulses, and occipital lobe is responsible for collecting the visual information, and temporal lobe, which is located below the lateral sulcus, and it is responsible for audition or auditory perception, musical development of the musical skill, etc. So these 4 lobes are the main part of the cerebral hemisphere, and other than these, the insular lobe and limbic lobes are also there. So here you can find that the central sulcus and lateral sulcus, and this one lateral sulcus, it actually divides the lobe, that is the frontal lobe, parietal lobe and temporal lobe, and this imaginary line of the parieto-occipital sulcus divides the occipital sulcus from the parietal lobe and temporal lobe. So the imaginary line of the posterior occipital sulcus and the extension of the lateral sulcus divides the occipital lobe from parietal and temporal lobe. So this is the structure of the cerebrum. This is side view. This is central sulcus. You can find it here. And this is lateral sulcus. And lateral sulcus is again divided into these three portions, that is the posterior ramus, ascending ramus, anterior ramus, and one part is called as stem. So if you look through the external features of the cerebral hemisphere, so each cerebral hemisphere has three borders, three poles, and three surfaces. So each cerebral hemisphere has three borders, three poles, and three surfaces. So what you can find here, you can find the different types of different borders, that is different borders are here. So these are superior medial border, so this one, okay, and then inferior medial border, this one, and inferior lateral border, this one. So these three are the three borders, and superior medial border and inferior lateral border, they cover the superior lateral surface, and inferior surface is located in between the inferior medial border and inferior lateral border. Then inferior medial border having two parts. If you look look the brain inferiorly, the inferior aspect of the cerebral hemisphere shows that it has medial border, medial orbital border, and it has medial occipital border. So it is located nearer to the occipital lobe, on the posterior side, and medial orbital border, that is on the frontal side nearer to the eye. The optical border and the orbital part of the inferior lateral border is called as superior ciliary border. So this is known as superior ciliary border. So cerebral hemisphere are having three poles, three major poles. One is frontal pole, then temporal pole, and the occipital pole. So there are three poles in the cerebral hemisphere. Number one is frontal pole, number two is temporal pole, and number three is occipital pole. So these are the three poles. And as I told earlier, it is having three surfaces. Number one is superior lateral surface, which is extended from superior medial border to the inferior lateral border, and number two, inferior surfaces, which is extended from inferior medial border to the inferior lateral border, and we are having the orbital surface, this one, and tentorial surfaces, and these two surfaces combinedly form the medial surface. So these two surfaces combinedly form the medial surface. So along with this, if we go through the external feature of the cerebral hemisphere, it is consisting of several numbers of sulci and gyres. The surfaces of the cerebral hemisphere are not smooth, as because the whole cerebral hemisphere had been adjusted in a small cranium, and that's why the cerebral hemisphere is evaginated. And in these evaginated portions, the deep ferro-like portions, and there are deep ferro-like portion and engraved portions. The series of grooves are called as sulci, and they are separated by intervening areas which are called gyres. So these are the sulcus, and these are the in between the sulcus there are gyres. So this is lateral sulcus, what I told earlier. This is the ascending ramus of the lateral sulcus, anterior ramus, and lateral, and this is the stem, and this is the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. This is superior temporal sulcus. This is inferior temporal sulcus. As it is located on the top, that's why it is called as superior temporal sulcus, and it is called as inferior temporal sulcus. This is known as superior frontal sulcus. This is inferior frontal sulcus, like the temporal gyrus, temporal sulcus. So this is superior frontal gyrus, medial frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. So three major gyruses. Here also three major gyruses, that is superior temporal gyrus, medial temporal gyrus, and inferior temporal gyrus. Central sulcus is having two it divides the cerebrum or cerebral hemisphere into two region, that is the frontal lobe and parietal lobe. The region which is located in front of the central sulcus is called as precentral gyrus, and the region which is located behind the central sulcus is called as postcentral gyrus. So these two gyrus, one is the part of the precentral gyrus is the part of the frontal lobe, while the postcentral gyrus is a part of the parietal lobe. So this region is called as inferior parietal lobe. This portion is called as inferior parietal lobe, and this is known as occipital lobe. So it is having different sulcus and gyrus. So all these parts has been taken from the textbook of Human Neuroanatomy by Indra Singh.